for the Americans here, Happy Independence Day. I hope you remember all the barbecues, the homemade ice cream, and the 4th of July parades with fond memories. Thank you for having me. I've been enjoying life here in Ahihi for 6.5 years, and I'm probably no different than you. Whether we've been here for 3 months or 30 years, we all love Lakeside and feel truly blessed to be here. Unitarian congregations sometimes claim their ministers' Sunday morning talks were book reports. And it is true. And I confess there were a few times I did this in my 25 years of ministry. Today, though, I'm just a person in front of a group, knowing you already know this is a book report. The Great Improvisation is a comprehensive book consisting of 583 pages. Now, do you think if I saw that on B. Dalton's bookshelf, I would pick it up? No. But I read an article about it, and I thought it had to be interesting. So I ordered online. After I got it on my computer, and after I changed the type font to ginormous, I saw 2,000 pages. And I said to myself, it's so long, but it's probably because of your letters are so big. Well, it was long. This talk will focus on Benjamin Franklin in France and his improvisation from an American citizen to a world-renowned diplomat. I will share the strategy he used to fulfill in his mission. He did not claim to be a diplomat, but he knew human nature, and he knew how to maneuver and manipulate people in this politically sensitive game. And you can laugh anytime. I welcome that. The end of the story is the Treaty of Paris, which would have never happened without the support of King Louis XVI. Schiff begins her book. In December of 1776, a small boat delivered an old man to France. Typically, after an ocean crossing, his eyes brim with tears at the sight of land. But he had just withstood the most brutal voyage of his life. For 30 days he had pitched about violently on the wintry Atlantic, in a cramped cabin and under unremitting dark skies. He had barely the strength to stand. The Continental Congress had declared independence with no viable means of achieving it. Everyone in Congress knew that without munitions, money, or credit, there would be no independence. To defeat King George's highly trained and experienced troops, they would need help. They would look to France. If you send someone to Versailles, who do you send? Who in all the colonies had the experiences of European courts? Who had the wit and diplomatic conversation to achieve the necessary ends? Who else? Benjamin Franklin. He had spent 11 years in England representing Pennsylvania and other colonies at the court of King George. There was no one as qualified as the capable Mr. Franklin. Franklin was not an ambassador nor a diplomat. The great improvisation lay in his ability to adapt his wit and wisdom to persuade King Louis XVI to share his gold from his treasury. Franklin would fit in, and Schiff wrote, "He happened to do a fine imitation of a French courtier. He knew better than to confuse straightforwardness with candor. He was honest, but not too honest. A master of the oblique approach, a dabbler in shades of gray, Franklin was a natural diplomat, genial and ruthless. He was possessed of a remarkably logical mind. The French would marvel over his ability to reduce any problems to its simplest terms. And above all, he took to France personal prestige. Franklin, world-renowned as the tamer of lightning, rode into Paris as America's first international celebrity. The French placed significant value on both the arts and scientists. Benjamin Franklin, the renowned American inventor and scientist, was widely recognized by individuals across all educational backgrounds. His likeness was frequently depicted on various objects, resulting in his image becoming commonplace in households of every social class. Owing to persistent requests from artists, Franklin eventually advised them to replicate existing portraits rather than request additional settings. Schiff wrote, "The Parisian posting did not bring out the best in any of the American envoys, and Franklin was no exception. His charisma, his ingenuity, his silkiness were strengths. The flaws stand out in high relief. He could be negligent, manipulative, inconsistent, unmethodical, uncommunicative, vindictive, breathtaking, imprecise. He set his colleagues' teeth on edge, and none more so than John Adams. Franklin's greatest enemies in France were his compatriots." Whatever one might say of Franklin, he went about his work in France doggedly, persistently, and with an unfailing passion for American independence. Now, there was an emissary sent to France before Franklin, Silas Deane. He arrived in Paris the summer of 1776. He was sent to obtain supplies for 25,000 soldiers, clothing, munitions, and warship. Without an official title or Congress's blessing, Deane acted under the Committee of Secret Correspondence. He was to assess political sentiment. A lawyer and former delegate from Connecticut, Deane posed as an traitor. His controversial nature suited the covert mission despite his lack of qualifications. Franklin settled in Passy, an idyllic village 2 miles west of Paris. His landlord was Deschamps, a very wealthy merchant and active in court life. He served sometimes as the intermediary between Franklin and the court of Versailles. From his influential role, Chaumont helped supply the colonies. He also paid for campaigns in 1778 and 1782. One of the first officials to whom Franklin would connect was de Carlos Vergennes, the French foreign minister. Vergennes' predecessor had signed the 1763 treaty with England. Verges would harbor a deep-seated hatred of England and would be one of the most amenable Frenchmen to American independence. Schiff wrote, in 1775, Vergennes sent an emissary to Philadelphia to investigate whether America might be inclined to engage in that time-honored French sport, baiting the British. Franklin, at the secret meeting with the emissary, was not moved to support the effort. He did not believe it would benefit the colonies to so publicly pursue the request. Without Vergennes and his personal determination to see England lose the colonies, the outcome might have been different. During 1776, de Beaumarchais, a playwright, decided he could help the colonies, for it would benefit his reputation as well as his business. He had been a secret agent for Versailles and had proven trustworthy. Beaumarchais was known for stealing scenes when he performed, and the foreign ministry thought he would be a perfect agent for secret activities. It was Beaumarchais who first supplied aid to the colonies, and when Franklin landed on the shores of France, Beaumarchais was outfitting 2 ships to take more supplies and soldiers to the colonies. He assured Versailles that George Washington had 80,000 men who were in dire straits for guns and ammunition. When Franklin arrived in France, there were only 30,000 bedraggled men in the Confederate Army. They had little guns and ammunition, without shoes or even uniforms, and were defeated in every encounter with the British. When Viscount Stormont, the English ambassador, found out that Franklin was in France, he was indignant that France would welcome the Americans. Stormont complained to Versailles. He had heard of French aid, and if Franklin was there, what was his purpose? It is significant to note, although it is not surprising, Stormont was the most surveilled person in France at the time. There were even those spies who spied on the spies who spied on Stormont. Stormont had heard a rumor that Franklin had offered France unfettered access to trade with the colonies. But at that time, Franklin had not even met Vergennes. Dean acquired large amounts of explosives and uniforms from Beaumarchais and other French sources. He authorized soldiers and officers to join the Continental Army, making France's first support effort. Dean never met with Vergennes, but felt more confident after securing these resources. Meanwhile, Franklin is making his way to Versailles. One of the few men in France that hated each mile Franklin traveled was Stormont. His spies reported the progress, and Stormont became angrier by the day. He met with Versailles and complained, as Franklin was still making his way to Versailles. Vergennes did little to placate Stormont and quietly shrugged his shoulders. By the time Franklin reached Versailles, another emissary from the Continental Congress had arrived, Arthur Lee. Dean had requested another emissary long before Franklin left for France. Now, after Franklin was settled in Passy, Vergennes agreed to meet with all 3 emissaries to Versailles. Vergennes made it clear that the emissaries should lie low to avoid any repercussions from England And at the same time, he assured the men that France's ports would be open to them. Versailles' authority came directly from Louis XVI. He had told Versailles to respond, and I quote, in a way that did not entirely extinguish their hopes. It was common knowledge at that time that 30,000 light muskets and 200 field pieces were making their way across the Atlantic from the King's Arsenal to America. Vergennes did not admit to knowing this at any time during the meeting. On December the 29th, Franklin met with the ambassador to France, Conde de Aranda. Franklin told Aranda that he had full powers of the American Congress. He affirmed the colony's resolve for independence. He asked for State Harbor for American ships to sell cargo. Aranda reminded Franklin that because of treaties with England, it would be impossible to grant access to Spanish ports. Franklin assured Aranda before the evening was out, the Americans were in no immediate need of assistance. Someone in Franklin's confidence later told the Spanish ambassador that Congress did not want to come humbly begging or manifest extreme need, as they feared onerous obligations. Later, when Aranda met with Vergennes, they shared mutual surprise that the Americans did not beg for aid and protection. Vergennes thought at the time that Americans might end the war with a separate peace, which would leave France vulnerable to England. Furthermore, Vergennes thought the Congress had little cohesion, no real authority. They couldn't or wouldn't institute a tax to fund the revolution, and quite frankly, he wasn't sure they could govern the new republic. Around the same time, early January, one of Beaumarchais' ships, loaded with muskets and ammunition, had to abort her journey to the colonies because no one on the ship knew how to get there.
Oh my God.
Of course, Dean was the brunt of retributions or recriminations. Somehow, Vergennes found 2 million livres to replace the lost aid. Franklin settled into France's social life and scientific and arts communities right away. Of course, there were hundreds of people coming every day to solicit something from Benjamin Franklin. He was only able to see those who had political use, those he knew to be scientists, and those who were significant features in society, and his neighbors in passing. Franklin launched his French conquest of Paris from a yellow and red salon that qualifies as Europe's preeminent newsroom. If good taste has an epicenter, its Parisian address in 1777 was the Saint-Germain apartment in which the blind 80-year-old Marquis du Dauphin held court twice a week. Her information was generally better than Paris's chief of police, who commanded not only the police, but thousands of spies. Dudefant held court as if she were an empress, and in a way, she was. Madame Dudefant was a committed Anglophile, and her favorite diplomat was Stormont. Nevertheless, she knew Franklin to be a remarkable public figure and welcomed him. Another guest that day was Madame de Luxembourg, another famous, scandalous libertine, almost as dominant in society as defined. The other guests were aristocratic liberals, and there is no way to calculate the impact Franklin had that day. Schiff writes, Franklin came away from the salon with flying colors. In France, as in any other European city, there are rules. One that Franklin broke that day was the rule that a person was to talk as much as everyone else. Franklin more easily wrote than spoke. He was always quiet and reflective in his social engagements. Throughout his time in France, he most often broke the rules of conversation, fashion, and diplomacy. However, he was forgiven his foibles by everyone. As we will see later, this quiet reticence was quite useful during diplomatic deliberations. His behavior of breaking societal norms only enhanced his persona with France. And Schiff wrote, soon enough, Franklin's reserve, what had passed in America for perpetual taciturnity, became in France sublime reticence. In prattling about Paris, it was noted that Franklin did something extraordinary. He listened. And any word that did escape his lips sped instantly around the kingdom. During January, the papers reported that the gift of the season was a Franklin portrait for the mantle. It was difficult to find anyone in France who had not seen his portrait and who did not consider Franklin as a friend to humankind. Stormont, however, was letting everyone know that Franklin was old news. But on the 15th of January, King Louis granted the American commissioners 2 million livres without interest, payable when the United States are settled in peace and prosperity. A gift so secret, the envoys vaguely credited to an unnamed private person when they reported it to Congress. There were no documents found which would testify to that gift. Now, Franklin knew he was surrounded by spies. A friend told him so himself, and the friend himself was a spy. Franklin refused to clear out and clean up the many papers he had scattered throughout his office. Franklin had no interest in subterfuge, and he said to his friend, "It is simply this," he shrugged, "to be concerned in no affairs that I should blush to have made public. To do nothing but what spies may see and welcome." He insisted, nothing to conceal. Already his methods had produced results. He had thrown Stormont off the trail. Schiff wrote, Franklin also seriously underestimated the deceitfulness of those around him. By April, due in part to Franklin's popularity and the fact that France had not been at war since the end of the French-Indian War of 1763, more titled officers and soldiers were eager to sail to America for the fight. By the summer of 1777, Silas Deane had sent hundreds of soldiers to the States. And by the fall of 1777, Franklin received a letter from General Washington to stop sending those hordes of soldiers. There was no money to pay them, and he did not have the patience, nor could he tolerate their incessant demands for title and rank. Nor did Washington have the resources to support them. Arthur Lee was to be the eternal thorn in Franklin's side. He was not only an alcoholic, but he was also mentally unstable. He was quarrelsome and reported all of Franklin's behavior in as negative a way as he could to his brother and cousin in Congress, who for the rest of the war were Franklin's enemies. As you might be thinking, the Lees were from Virginia and members of the Southern faction. And yes, they were ancestors of Robert E. Lee. They despised Franklin for several reasons. His low class of family, his illegitimate son, his illegitimate grandson. He was from the North. And simply because their brother and cousin hated Benjamin Franklin. Many times they tried to have Franklin recalled. The last time they tried, they were able to convene Congress for a general debate on Franklin's worthiness. What happened during that debate? Congress voted to promote Franklin from emissary to minister plenipotentiary, the equivalent of what we now call ambassadors. I had to laugh at that. Franklin knew he was no diplomat, but he knew people. Schiff wrote, the father of self-reliance was an unhappy beggar. He was to never waver in his conviction that asking for help was the worst way of obtaining it. From the start, he held that America's best interest lay in allowing France to act in what she considered to be her own best interests. He felt he could afford to be patient. He was certain France would never abide the colony's return to British dominion. In 1777, the commissioners, Deane, Franklin, and Lee, not having heard from Congress, decided to, 1, have 6 ships built, 2, send Arthur Lee to the court of Madrid, 3, purchase additional second-hand munitions from France's arsenal, and 4, stop hearing solicitations. Now, Comte de Maurepas, who was the oldest member of the King's Court and held a position like Secretary of State, agreed to meet with the Americans, although he supported Stormont. A secret meeting was planned, but at the last minute it was discovered and canceled. And from then on to almost to the end of the Revolution, Maurepas did not trust the Americans. In March of 1778, Franklin finally heard from Congress. His instructions were to pursue the French court aggressively. Franklin knew the war was not going well, but he was determined to keep that news as secret as possible. He did arrange for the Articles of Confederation to be printed and distributed throughout Europe. A French general, Duc de Croix, a decorated naval captain, called on Franklin. He, like Fouché, could not believe that a confederation as large as the 13 colonies could ever agree. And furthermore, he did not see how such a union could stand together for so long. Franklin gave nothing away. All de Croix's arguments against the possibility of success neither swayed Franklin nor caused any more concern than he already had. France waited for a victory on which to bank support, while Washington banked on French aid with which he might deliver a victory. Now, Franklin knew several things about the latest conflict, or the latest from the latest dispatch. You realize it took at least a month, if not 6 weeks, to get there. One, he knew the rebels were well provided for at that time. And two, casualties at Forts Lake and Washington were over-reported by the British. Specifically, there was not enough Americans defending the forts to justify those numbers. And three, Franklin knew, British atrocities only further embittered his countrymen, ensuring a longer and bloodier war. He told the Secret Correspondence Committee in May, "We need to allow France the time to decide to support the Americans. That way we will not be so bothersome." Now, I know I'm running out of time, but I have to share one story from the book. Franklin had a visitor in 78 who was a former master school teacher who hitchhiked from the bottom of France up to Versailles, and he shared with Franklin his idea of creating a United Nations, so to speak. And he also, a couple of things from his paper, was that the Suez Canal and the other canal, where the Panama Canal should be dug. And this was in 1778, 79. On March the 20th, 1777, King Louis received Franklin at the court of Versailles. Of all his accomplishments, Benjamin Franklin probably thought his presentation to the court was the epitome of his public service. Schiff wrote, "For the first time he heard himself announced as a deputy of the United Provinces of North America, rather than of 13 colonies. And the French monarch addressed Franklin with more care and grace than he was known to possess." He said, "Please assure Congress of my friendship. I hope this will be good for the two countries." On July the 10th, Franklin felt confident enough to order up terms for a peace to Sturmont. They were directives from Congress. The non-negotiable articles were complete independence, the evacuation of troops from American soil, boundaries that took the country to the Great Lakes and the Mississippi, doubling its size, and the right to fish off Newfoundland. The second set of terms Franklin made up. for himself. One of them was an apology to Sturmont, and then his personal belief that those who remained loyal to the crown would have no compensation after the war was over. He never wavered on this. However, we know that in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, all loyalists were compensated. On December the 4th, 1777, Beaumarchais rode to Passy. He was going to tell Franklin that a messenger was on the way. And at 11:30 that morning, a young patriot, Jonathan Loring Austin, from the Continental Army, rode into the courtyard. His voyage had taken 4 weeks, and Franklin ran into the courtyard and said, "Is Philadelphia taken?" And Austin had to say, "Yes, sir." And Franklin turned around and started to walk off. And Austin said, "But sir, I have greater news. General Burgoyne and his whole army are prisoners of war." It was the Battle of Saratoga. Franklin could not set his hands to the printer fast enough to share that news. And he added, "The imminent ruin of General Howe encircled by Washington in Philadelphia."